The rain fell in thin, apologetic sheets against the window pane of Clara's tiny apartment, mirroring the quiet desperation in her heart. Every drop seemed to count the seconds ticking away, the seconds until a blind date she couldn't afford to miss and certainly couldn't afford to ruin. She smoothed down the fabric of her simple, worn but immaculate dress for the 10th time, her reflection in the glass showing a pale, blonde woman whose quiet strength was being tested to its absolute limit. Beside her, 5-year-old Leo sat on the floor, humming softly as he colored a ferocious-looking dinosaur with a bright purple crayon, blessedly unaware of the storm brewing both outside and inside his mother. The phone call had come an hour ago. A frantic apology from her babysitter, a family emergency, an unavoidable cancellation. Panic had seized Clara in its icy grip. This date was a favor, a setup by her well-meaning friend who had spoken in hushed, excited tones about a man who was successful and a true gentleman. Clara hadn't cared about the success, but after 3 years of grueling shifts at the diner and a life that felt like a constant battle against a rising tide of bills, the idea of a gentleman, of a simple, pleasant conversation with an adult, had felt like a lifeline. Now, that lifeline was frayed. She had no one else to call, no money for a last-minute service. The thought of canceling was a weight in her chest, a surrender she wasn't willing to make. So she had made a decision, a wild, reckless, deeply humiliating decision. She would go, and she would take Leo with her. She would walk into the fanciest restaurant she had ever set foot in, apologize to a complete stranger, and then walk right back out into the rain. It was a plan born of pure despair. She knelt beside her son, her voice soft. "Leo, my love, are you ready for a little adventure?" Leo looked up, his bright blue eyes wide with trust, and held up his masterpiece. "He's for the man, Mommy, so he won't be sad." Her heart clenched. How could she explain that the man would more likely be furious than sad? She tucked the drawing carefully into her worn handbag, a fragile shield against the mortification to come. The restaurant was a world away from her own. All low lighting, gleaming wood, and the hushed clinking of silver on porcelain. A wave of inadequacy washed over her as the maitre d' looked down his nose at her simple dress and the small, quiet boy holding her hand. When she gave the name for the reservation, Julian Vance, his eyebrows shot up in surprise before he masked it with a veneer of professional courtesy. He led them toward a secluded booth in the back, and there he was. He was handsome, but in a severe, sculpted way, like a statue carved from granite. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit impossibly crisp, and his posture was so rigid he seemed fused to the plush leather of the booth. He looked up from his phone as they approached, his expression a mask of cool indifference. Then his eyes fell on Leo, and the mask flickered. Clara's words came out in a rushed, trembling whisper, the apology she had rehearsed 100 times on the bus ride over. "Mr. Vance, I am so incredibly sorry. My name is Clara. My babysitter canceled at the last minute. I should have just called the restaurant, I know, but I didn't want to be rude. I only came to apologize in person. We'll be leaving right now." She clutched Leo's hand, ready to flee. Julian Vance didn't speak for a long moment. He simply watched her, his gaze intense, analytical. He looked at her frayed coat, her earnest, frightened eyes, and the small boy who stood beside her, silent and observant. He had expected another socialite, another woman curated by his mother, whose laughter would be as calculated as her portfolio. He had not expected this. This raw, unfiltered honesty. This vulnerability. He finally lowered his gaze to Leo, who, feeling the weight of the silence, chose that moment to shyly extend his hand, a purple and green drawing clutched in his small fist. "This is for you," Leo said, his voice barely audible. "So you won't be sad." Julian took the drawing. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess of a dinosaur. He looked from the drawing to the boy, and then to the mother, whose face was now flushed with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. The word sad echoed in the sterile chambers of his heart. No one had ever considered his emotional state. They considered his net worth, his influence, his name. But this child, this stranger, had seen something in his stern face that even he had forgotten was there. A deep, abiding loneliness. A muscle in his jaw tightened. His response, when it came, was not what she expected. It was not what he expected. "Please," Julian Vance said, his voice quieter, less rigid than she imagined. "Stay." The word hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge over a chasm of social difference. Clara stared at him, bewildered. Stay? With her son? On a blind date with a man who looked like he owned the building, if not the entire city block? Every instinct screamed at her to run, to retreat to the safety of her small world where she understood the rules. But then she looked at Julian, truly looked at him, and saw past the expensive suit and the stern expression. She saw the flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't pity or anger. It was intrigue, and perhaps, just perhaps, a loneliness that resonated with her own. She took a breath, a silent nod her only reply, and slid into the booth opposite him, Leo scrambling in beside her. The dinner that followed was a study in gentle awkwardness. Julian, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and navigating multi-billion-dollar deals, was completely out of his depth. He tried to make conversation, but his questions were sterile, detached, as if he were interviewing her for a position. "What is your 5-year plan, Clara?" he had asked, making her almost choke on her water. She gave a small, wry smile. "My 5-year plan is to make sure the electricity stays on next month and that Leo has new shoes for school." The answer seemed to recalibrate him. He fell silent, observing her, observing Leo, who was meticulously arranging his green beans into a fortress on his plate. The chasm between their worlds felt vast, insurmountable. It was Leo, the innocent truth-teller, who bridged it. He looked up at Julian, his expression serious. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Julian, startled, blinked. I haven't given them much thought." "You should," Leo said with the profound conviction of a 5-year-old. "They're very brave." He then slid his crayon drawing across the table. "This is a Vancosaurus. He has a big roar, but he's not mean." Julian stared at the drawing. A Vancosaurus. A smile, a genuine, uncalculated smile, touched his lips for the first time that evening. It transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines and revealing a warmth she hadn't known was there. He picked up the drawing and studied it intently. "Thank you, Leo. I'll keep him safe." From that moment, the tension eased. Clara found herself talking, not about 5-year plans, but about Leo's love for the library, about the stray cat she fed on her apartment steps, about the simple, profound joy of watching her son sleep. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to be anyone other than who she was. A mother, a waitress, a woman who found beauty in the small, overlooked corners of life. Julian, in turn, listened. He was captivated. The women in his world spoke of galas, of acquisitions, of appearances. Their kindness was a currency, their conversations a negotiation. Clara's sincerity was a foreign language he found himself desperately wanting to understand. He saw in her a form of wealth he couldn't acquire, a strength he couldn't manufacture. It was the quiet strength of a woman who had nothing, and therefore had nothing to lose by being herself. As the evening drew to a close and the waiter cleared their plates, the old Julian, the titan of industry, briefly resurfaced. The transactional man who solved every problem with money. He reached into his jacket. "Clara," he said, his voice formal again. "For your troubles tonight. The babysitter. Please." He slid a small, thick envelope across the table. Clara looked at the envelope, then back at his face. His expression was earnest, yet it was the most profound misreading of her he could have possibly made. She gently pushed the envelope back toward him. "My time with my son is never a trouble, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft but firm, leaving no room for argument. "And my dignity isn't for sale." His eyes widened slightly. He was a man who could buy anything, silence anyone, solve any problem with a wire transfer. But he could not buy her. Her refusal wasn't an act of defiance. It was a simple statement of fact, a declaration of a moral code his money couldn't touch. He felt as though a wall inside him, a wall he hadn't even known existed, had just sustained its first crack. He looked at this woman, this waitress with worn shoes and an unshakable sense of self, and felt a stunning, terrifying realization. He didn't just want to understand her world. He wanted to be a part of it. The drive home to his sprawling, minimalist mansion in the hills felt different that night. The pristine silence of the car, usually a comfort, felt oppressive. The city lights below, a glittering testament to his success, seemed cold and distant. Julian Vance couldn't stop thinking about Clara. He couldn't stop thinking about the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her son, the quiet determination in her voice when she refused his money, the genuine warmth that radiated from her like a hearth. He walked into his home, a cavern of glass and steel that had been featured in architectural magazines for its cold, stark beauty. It was a house, not a home. The silence that greeted him was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the air filtration system. His own daughter, 4-year-old Lily, was asleep upstairs, tended to by a highly paid night nurse. Lily. His heart ached with a familiar, helpless pain. Since her mother's death 2 years ago, Lily had retreated into a world of silence, her laughter and light extinguished. She moved through the vast, empty rooms like a little ghost, her large, expressive eyes her only form of communication. He had hired the best child psychologists, the most experienced nannies, but none of them could breach the walls she had built around her heart. He thought of Leo, so full of life and confidence, offering him a drawing of a dinosaur. He thought of the easy, unconditional love that flowed between Clara and her son. He saw, with a sudden, painful clarity, what was missing from his own life, from Lily's life. It wasn't a thing money could buy. It was a feeling. It was warmth. It was Clara. An idea, audacious and desperate, began to form in his mind. He needed that light in his house. He needed it for Lily. He found himself dialing his personal assistant at an hour he knew was unforgivably late. The instructions were simple: find out where Clara worked. The next afternoon, a sleek black town car, so out of place it looked like a spaceship, pulled up outside the Corner Spoon, the humble diner where Clara worked. Julian stepped out, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the faded linoleum floors and the smell of coffee and fried bacon. He saw Clara behind the counter, her blonde hair tied back, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She moved with an easy grace, refilling coffee cups, laughing with a regular at the counter. She belonged here. And yet, he was about to ask her to leave it all behind. He sat in a booth, and when she came to take his order, her eyes widened in shock. "Mr. Vance, what are you doing here?" He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I have a proposition for you, Clara." He laid it out for her, not as a personal request, but as a business offer. He spoke of his daughter, Lily, of her selective mutism. He offered Clara a job, not as a nanny. The word felt too clinical, but as a child companion for Lily. The salary he named was astronomical, enough to solve all her financial problems for a decade. He watched her face, expecting to see relief, excitement. Instead, he saw hesitation. Her brow furrowed, a proud, guarded look entering her eyes. She recognized the gesture for what it was, at least in part: charity. A way for him to give her the money she had refused. "I'm a waitress, Mr. Vance. I'm not a child psychologist," she said quietly. "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity," he insisted, leaning forward, his voice earnest. "I saw you with your son. I saw a connection, a warmth that I can't provide for my daughter. I don't know how. I am hiring you for your expertise. Your expertise in kindness." The words hung in the air. Expertise in kindness. She looked out the diner window, at the passing traffic, her mind racing. The overdue rent notice on her fridge flashed in her mind. The thought of Leo having a real yard to play in, of not having to worry every single day. It was a lifeline she couldn't ignore. But her pride, her integrity, was the one thing she truly owned. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "I'll accept. On 2 conditions. First, it's a trial basis. If I can't help your daughter, I won't take a cent more. And second, I earn my pay. I will work, Mr. Vance. I will cook, I will clean. I will not be a guest in your home." He found himself nodding, a profound sense of respect for her blooming in his chest. She was setting boundaries, maintaining her dignity even when accepting an offer that would change her life. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. "Agreed, Clara," he said. And in that moment, in the greasy Spoon diner with the smell of old coffee in the air, their 2 worlds didn't just collide. They began to merge. The first day Clara and Leo set foot in Julian's mansion was an exercise in stark contrasts. Leo's slightly scuffed sneakers squeaked on the polished marble floors as he stared up at the cavernous ceiling, his mouth agape. Clara, in her simple jeans and a faded t-shirt, clutched her handbag, feeling like an intruder in a modern art museum. The house was beautiful, impeccably designed, and utterly devoid of life. It was cold, not in temperature, but in spirit. The silence was a physical presence, heavy and unnerving. Julian led them to a grand living area where a small, dark-haired girl sat on a large white sofa, staring blankly at a television that wasn't even on. This was Lily. She was a fragile, porcelain doll of a child, her dark eyes holding a sorrow too vast for her little face. She didn't look up as they entered. She didn't acknowledge their existence at all. A professionally uniformed nanny stood stiffly by the fireplace, looking relieved at their arrival. Julian made the introductions, his voice tight, with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Lily, this is Clara and her son Leo." Lily didn't move. Clara's heart went out to the little girl. She saw not a problem to be solved, but a soul in pain. She knew better than to force an interaction. She gave Julian a small, reassuring smile, then turned to her own son. She didn't address Lily directly. Instead, she sat down on the floor, right in the middle of the expensive Persian rug, and pulled a small bag of building blocks from her bag. "Leo, my love," she said, her voice warm and conversational, creating a small, safe bubble of normalcy in the vast, intimidating room. "Let's build the tallest tower in the world." Leo, always happy to play, immediately joined her, his cheerful chatter filling the oppressive silence. They built, they laughed, their tower crashing down in a colorful explosion, only to be built up again. Julian watched from the doorway, a silent, helpless observer. He had never seen anyone just sit on his floor before. He had never heard genuine laughter echo in these halls. He watched his daughter, Lily, who had not moved from the sofa. But he saw a subtle shift. Her head was turned ever so slightly in their direction. Her eyes, which had been vacant, were now fixed on Clara and Leo. She was watching. Later that afternoon, Clara found her way to the kitchen. It was a chef's dream, all stainless steel and state-of-the-art appliances, but it was sterile and used. She found flour, sugar, eggs. Soon, the cold, clinical air of the mansion was filled with a scent it had likely never known. The warm, sweet, comforting aroma of baking chocolate chip cookies. It was a scent from another world. A world of warmth, of home. The scent did what no psychologist or nanny had been able to do. It lured the little ghost from her perch. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, a silent, curious observer. She watched as Clara pulled a tray of golden brown cookies from the oven. Leo, his face already smudged with chocolate, danced around her feet in excitement. Clara saw Lily in the doorway but didn't make a fuss. She simply smiled and placed a cookie on a small plate. "Leo, why don't you see if Lily would like a cookie?" she said gently. Leo, in his innocent, direct way, walked over to Lily and held out the plate. Lily stared at the cookie, then at Leo, then at Clara. For a long, breathless moment, she did nothing. Then, her tiny hand reached out and took the cookie. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. But she took the cookie. And in that silent, cavernous house, it felt like a shout of triumph. Julian, who had been watching from the hallway, felt a lump form in his throat. He saw Clara, not as his employee, but as a magician, conjuring life and warmth in the desolate landscape of his home. He started to find excuses to leave the office earlier, drawn by an invisible thread back to his own house. He would stand in the shadows of the hallway, listening to the sound of Clara reading a story to both Leo and a silent, but attentive, Lily. He would watch as she taught them to make finger paintings on the vast glass doors that led to the garden, smearing vibrant, messy life onto his pristine, ordered world. Their own conversations began to change. They were no longer about the terms of her employment. Late one evening, after the children were asleep, they sat in the kitchen, sharing a simple cup of tea. He found himself telling her about his late wife, about the sudden illness that had stolen her away, about the guilt he carried, the feeling that he had been so busy building an empire that he had forgotten to build a life. She didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She just listened, her empathetic gaze making him feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The house was changing. The children were changing. And Julian Vance, the wounded titan, was beginning to feel the first, terrifying, wonderful thaw of his frozen heart. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day so ordinary it was destined for a miracle. Clara was in the garden with the children, showing them how the petals of a rose felt like velvet. Lily, who had been following Clara like a silent shadow for weeks, reached out a tentative finger to touch a soft pink petal. Clara smiled. "It's beautiful, isn't it, sweet girl?" Lily looked up at Clara, her dark eyes searching. She opened her mouth, and a small, raspy sound emerged, a word no one had heard her speak in 2 years. More. It was just one word. A whisper. But it was a sonic boom in the silent world of the Vance mansion. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she knelt and hugged the little girl, who, for the first time, didn't stiffen at the embrace but leaned into it. When Julian came home that evening, Clara met him at the door, her face radiant. She told him what had happened. He didn't speak. He walked straight to the garden, where Lily was now sitting with Leo, pointing at flowers. He called her name, and for the first time, she looked at him and gave him a small, hesitant smile. He felt a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees. He turned and looked at Clara, who had followed him out. The gratitude, the awe, the burgeoning love he felt for her was all there in his eyes. The space between them crackled with an unspoken intensity. He took a step toward her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. This was more than gratitude. This was something else, something deeper, something that was pulling them together with an undeniable force. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. It was the moment before a kiss, a moment filled with all the hope and fear of a new beginning. And it was in that exact moment of fragile, heart-stopping intimacy that a sharp, imperious voice cut through the air. "Julian? What on earth is going on here?" They sprang apart as if electrocuted. Standing on the patio was a woman who was the mirror image of Julian's severity, only colder. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored designer suit, her silver hair styled in a severe chignon, was Eleanor Vance, Julian's mother. Her eyes, the color of ice chips, swept over the scene with undisguised disapproval. She took in Clara's simple clothes, her flushed face, her son playing in the dirt with her granddaughter, and her perfectly lipsticked mouth tightened into a thin, hard line. She saw not a moment of connection, but a transaction, a lapse in judgment. "Who?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is this?" Eleanor's presence instantly chilled the warm evening air. Julian's posture straightened, the soft, open man of a moment ago replaced by the guarded CEO. He made the introductions, his voice strained. "Mother, this is Clara. She is helping with Lily." Eleanor's gaze raked over Clara, a swift, brutal appraisal that dismissed her as completely insignificant. "The help?" she said, the words a clear insult. She ignored Clara entirely and turned her full, formidable attention on her son. Later that evening, after Clara had taken a subdued Leo and a quiet Lily upstairs, the confrontation erupted. Eleanor's voice, though never raised, was a weapon. She stood in the center of the vast living room, a queen surveying a tainted kingdom. "A waitress, Julian? You brought a waitress into this house to care for your daughter?" she hissed. "Have you lost your mind? Think of the optics. Think of our name." "She is good for Lily," Julian countered, his voice low, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Lily spoke today, Mother. For the first time in 2 years, she spoke. Because of Clara." "A coincidence," Eleanor scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "The girl is a predator, Julian. An opportunist. She sees a grieving, vulnerable billionaire and his damaged child, and she sees a winning lottery ticket. Women like her are a dime a dozen. They prey on men like you." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to exploit his deepest insecurities. His guilt over his wife's death, his responsibility as the head of the Vance empire, his fear of being taken advantage of. He wanted to scream, to defend the genuine, selfless woman he was coming to love, but his mother's poison was potent. It didn't make him doubt Clara's character, but it made him doubt everything else. The chasm between their worlds, which had seemed to be closing, was suddenly ripped wide open again. Could he really bring this gentle, simple woman into his predatory world of corporate intrigue and vicious high society? Could she survive it? Unbeknownst to them, Clara, on her way back downstairs to retrieve Leo's forgotten dinosaur drawing, stood frozen in the shadows of the hallway. She heard Eleanor's cruel words, predator, opportunist, lottery ticket. The words didn't just sting. They confirmed her most profound, secret fear. That no matter how kind she was, no matter how much she cared for Lily, in this world, she would only ever be seen as the help. A gold digger. A nobody. The warmth of the near kiss in the garden turned to ash in her heart, replaced by the cold, bitter realization that she did not belong here. She was a trespasser in a world that would never, ever accept her. Eleanor, having failed to convince Julian with her words alone, escalated her campaign. A woman of her influence had contacts, and she used them without a shred of remorse. A few days later, the storm broke. Julian was in a board meeting when his phone began buzzing incessantly. His head of PR burst into the room, his face pale, holding a tablet. On the screen was the blaring headline of a notorious gossip website, Billionaire CEO's New Nanny. A Cinderella story or a cunning trap? The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and cruelty. It featured a grainy photo of Clara in her waitress uniform, looking tired at the end of a long shift, juxtaposed with a crisp paparazzi shot of her entering the gates of the Vance estate. It painted a lurid picture of a conniving woman using a troubled child to sink her claws into one of the nation's wealthiest men. The story spread like wildfire, picked up by tabloids and mainstream news outlets alike. Clara's name was suddenly everywhere, her life reduced to a cheap, sensationalist narrative. The world that had never known she existed was now judging her, condemning her. The humiliation was a physical blow. When she went to the small grocery store in her old neighborhood, she felt the stares. She heard the whispers behind her back. At Leo's preschool, another mother gave her a look of pure contempt. Her small, safe world had been poisoned. She felt exposed, violated, and utterly powerless. Julian was incandescent with rage. He unleashed his army of lawyers and publicists, issuing threats, demanding retractions. He saw it as an attack, a problem to be managed with overwhelming force and financial power. He tried to shield Clara, to reassure her. "I'll handle this, Clara," he told her, his voice tight with fury. "I will sue them into oblivion. I'll protect you." But his words, meant to comfort, only highlighted the vast gulf between them. He saw it as a PR crisis. She saw it as a deeply personal violation. He thought he could protect her with his power, but she felt as though that very power was the source of her pain. She wasn't just a woman he was growing to love. She was now a scandal he had to manage, a liability to the Vance brand. The more he tried to fix it with his wealth and influence, the more she felt like an object, a problem piece on his corporate chessboard. The misunderstanding festered, a silent poison seeping into the fragile trust they had built. He was fighting for her, but in a language she didn't understand, a battle she never wanted to be a part of. She looked at him, the powerful CEO marshaling his forces, and she had never felt more alone, or more certain that she was a foreign body his world was violently trying to reject. The annual Vance Foundation Charity Gala, a glittering affair for the city's elite, loomed on the calendar. In previous years, Julian had considered it a tedious obligation. This year, he saw it as an opportunity, a battlefield on which he could make his stand. He would not hide Clara away. He would present her to his world, not as an employee, but as his partner, defying the gossip and the judgment with a public display of unity. He presented her with a dress box from a famous designer. Inside was a gown of deep sapphire silk, elegant and breathtakingly expensive. Clara looked at it, and instead of feeling like a princess, she felt like she was being put into a costume, a role she was not prepared to play. At the gala, she felt every eye on her. The whispers followed her like a shadow as she walked beside Julian, her hand trembling on his arm. "She cleans up well, for a waitress," one woman murmured behind her fan, the comment loud enough to be heard. Another group of women looked her up and down, their smiles like razor blades. She felt like an exhibit in a zoo, the exotic creature the billionaire had captured. Julian, oblivious to the subtle cuts and cruelties, was busy projecting an aura of defiant confidence. But then, a business rival of his, a man known for his brutish tactics, cornered Clara while Julian was greeting a donor. "You're the new acquisition, I hear," the man said with a greasy smile. "Tell me, is the return on investment as high as they say?" The crude, objectifying comment was the final straw. The beautiful dress felt like a cage, the glittering ballroom a torture chamber. She saw with sickening clarity that in this world, she would never be Clara. She would only ever be Julian Vance's latest possession. Later that night, the rain began to fall again, a hard, relentless downpour that lashed against the panoramic windows of the mansion. The storm outside was a perfect match for the tempest in Clara's soul. She looked around the silent, beautiful house, at the life she had briefly touched, a life of comfort and privilege. But it came at a price she was no longer willing to pay: her identity, her peace, her son's well-being. She could not raise Leo in a world that saw his mother as a headline. She could not stay with a man whose life would constantly subject her to this kind of cruel scrutiny. She believed, with a heavy, broken heart, that she was a burden to him, a scandal he would always have to manage. Her love for him, and for Lily, demanded that she leave. She sat at the large, sterile desk in Julian's home office and wrote a letter. Her tears mingled with the ink on the simple, heartfelt page. She didn't blame him. She thanked him for his kindness, for showing her a life she'd never imagined. She wrote of her love for Lily, but she explained, in the plain, honest language that was her nature, that she and Leo did not belong. They were from different worlds, and the bridge between them was on fire. With quiet, devastating efficiency, she packed the few belongings she and Leo had brought with them. She crept into Lily's room and kissed the sleeping girl's forehead, her heart physically aching with the pain of the silent goodbye. Then, carrying a sleeping Leo in her arms, she slipped out of the mansion into the rainy, unforgiving night, leaving the letter on Julian's desk like a final, formal surrender. The world she was returning to was one of struggle and uncertainty, but it was a world where she knew who she was. Julian woke to a silence that was different. It wasn't the usual quiet of his large, empty home. It was a profound, hollow emptiness. A void. He walked downstairs, an inexplicable sense of dread coiling in his stomach. The first sign was Leo's little toy dinosaur, left abandoned on the living room rug. Then he saw it. The letter, placed squarely in the center of his otherwise immaculate desk. He read it once, then again, the simple, devastating words blurring through a haze of disbelief. She was gone. The paper trembled in his hand as the reality crashed down on him. She had left. She had taken the light and the warmth and the laughter with her, plunging his world back into a darkness more profound than before. He ran upstairs to Lily's room. His daughter was awake, sitting up in her bed, her eyes wide with a familiar, heartbreaking fear. She looked at him, then at the empty space where Clara would normally be, and her face crumpled. A silent sob shook her small body. The barometer of their family's emotional health had plummeted to zero. The mansion, which Clara had begun to transform into a home, reverted to being a cold, sterile museum of his wealth. The smell of cookies was replaced by the scent of lemon-scented polish. The sound of laughter was replaced by the deafening tick of a grandfather clock in the hall. His mother, Eleanor, arrived, having heard the news through her network of staff. She tried to frame it as a victory. "It's for the best, Julian," she said, her voice crisp. The situation was becoming untenable. Now we can put this unfortunate chapter behind us. For the first time in his life, Julian looked at his mother and saw not a powerful matriarch, but a sad, misguided woman who equated reputation with happiness. A fire he hadn't known he possessed rose up in him. "You know nothing about happiness," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You drove away the only person who has ever made this house feel like a home. You drove away the only person who was able to reach my daughter. This isn't for the best. This is a tragedy of your own making." He walked away from her, leaving her stunned and speechless in the grand foyer. He went to Lily's room, where she was clutching a crayon drawing. It was a picture she had made with Clara's help. A stick figure of him, one of Clara, one of Leo, and one of herself, all holding hands under a brightly shining sun. It was a picture of a family he had allowed his world to destroy. His grand epiphany struck him then, with the force of a physical blow. He had been so wrong. Clara wasn't a problem to be managed. She was the answer. He thought he had been protecting her from his world, from the tabloids and the judgment. He should have been protecting their world, the small, warm world they were building together, from the cold, cruel intrusions of his. His mistake wasn't falling in love with a waitress. His mistake was thinking she needed to be polished and presented to fit into his world, instead of realizing that he needed to abandon that world and beg to be let into hers. Julian knew a phone call or a text message would be meaningless. Words were cheap. He had tried to solve a problem of the heart with money and power, and had failed spectacularly. Now, he needed to use a different currency, vulnerability. He needed a grand gesture, not of wealth, but of truth. He called a press conference at the Vance Corporation headquarters. The media, still buzzing from the tabloid scandal and Clara's sudden disappearance, gathered in droves, sharks smelling blood in the water. They expected a terse statement about a new merger, or perhaps a carefully worded denial of the rumors. His mother, Eleanor, sat in the front row, her face a mask of anxious disapproval, terrified of what he might say. Julian walked to the podium. He looked different. The usual armor of his tailored suit and confident demeanor was gone. He looked tired, vulnerable, but his eyes held a new, determined fire. He pushed aside the prepared notes his PR team had written. He leaned into the microphone, not as a CEO, but as a man. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear and steady, resonating through the silent room. "I won't be taking any questions today. I've called you here because I need to set the record straight. For the past week, you have been writing a story about me and about a woman named Clara, and you've gotten it completely, utterly wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Your stories painted a picture of a wealthy man and a woman of humble means. You framed it as a fairy tale or a cautionary tale, depending on your angle. But you missed the entire point. The story isn't about what she got from me. It's about what I learned from her." He spoke from the heart, his voice raw with emotion. He talked about loneliness, about the crushing emptiness of a life filled with everything but meaning. He described the difference between a house made of glass and steel and a home filled with the smell of cookies. "You called her an opportunist," he said, his voice dropping, filled with a quiet fury. "But Clara is the most honorable, selfless, and authentic person I have ever known. She is a woman who refused my money but gave my daughter back her voice. She has an expertise in kindness, a wealth of spirit that my fortune could never hope to match." He looked directly into the main camera, as if speaking to an audience of one. "I made a terrible mistake. I tried to protect her from my world, when I should have had the courage to join her in hers. I let the noise of gossip and judgment drown out the only thing that truly matters. So, Clara, if you are watching this, I am so sorry. I'm sorry for ever making you feel like you didn't belong. You don't belong in my world. I belong in yours." In her small, sparse apartment, Clara sat on her lumpy sofa, watching the broadcast on her small television. Leo was asleep in the other room. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to Julian's words. Every sentence was a validation, a healing balm on the wounds of the past week. He saw her. He truly saw her. The press conference ended. The screen filled with talking heads, analyzing the CEO's unprecedented emotional speech. Just then, there was a soft knock on her door. Her heart hammered in her chest. She opened it, and there he was. Julian. He wasn't the CEO from the television anymore. He was just a man, looking tired and hopeful and terrified, standing on her doorstep. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of afternoon sun streamed through the hallway window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In his hand, he held a slightly crinkled piece of paper. It was Lily's drawing of their family. He held it out to her. "I believe this belongs to us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't need to say anything else. His public declaration had been for the world. This moment was just for her. And then, in the cramped, humble hallway of her walk-up apartment, the billionaire CEO, Julian Vance, dropped to one knee. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Clara," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't have a grand plan. All I know is that my life is cold and empty without you and Leo in it. Please, will you marry me? Will you help me build a home?" Clara looked from his earnest, upturned face to the small, crayon drawing of a family in her hand. Through her own tears, a radiant smile broke through, a smile that lit up the entire room. There was no hesitation, no doubt. She had found the one place she truly belonged. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of all the love and hope she had thought was lost forever. "Yes, Julian, I will." Leo, woken by the emotional silence, padded out of his room, rubbing his eyes. He saw his mother crying, but smiling. He saw the important-looking man on his knee. He didn't understand the proposal, but he understood the feeling in the room. He ran forward and wrapped his small arms around both of them, creating a messy, joyful, tearful group hug. The two worlds, once separated by a chasm of wealth and status, had finally, beautifully, merged into one. 1 year later, the Vance mansion was unrecognizable. The cold, minimalist aesthetic had been replaced by a vibrant, joyful chaos. Children's paintings, including a professionally framed drawing of a Vance-osaurus, adorned the walls. Toys were scattered across the once pristine rugs, and the sound of laughter echoed through the halls, a constant, happy melody. It was a home. Julian, Clara, Leo, and a chattering, confident Lily stood on a stage in the mansion's sun-drenched garden. They were cutting a large blue ribbon, officially opening the Lily and Leo Foundation, a major new charity they had co-founded, dedicated to providing support for single parents and creating enrichment opportunities for underprivileged children. Clara, no longer the timid waitress but a poised, confident woman, stepped to the microphone to give a speech. She spoke about second chances, about the power of kindness, and about how true wealth is measured not in dollars, but in love. Julian stood beside her, his arm around her waist, looking at his wife with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. In the front row of the crowd, Eleanor Vance watched. Her once icy expression softened into a look of quiet pride. She had learned, the hard way, that her son's happiness was more valuable than any corporate merger or society column. As the applause faded, the family of four stepped off the stage, hand in hand. Julian swung Lily up onto his shoulders, while Clara chased a laughing Leo across the lawn. They were not a billionaire and a former waitress. They were simply a family, whole and happy, their love a quiet, powerful testament to the fact that the most valuable things in life are never for sale. The camera pulled back, showing the four of them playing together, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun, a perfect, heartwarming picture of a life rebuilt on a foundation of authentic love.